Story 1. The Bent Deer Tracks. I do wildlife survey work, or I did a lot more of it back then, and most of the time that means long hours of being alone without anybody asking how your weekend was or whether you remembered to eat lunch. I like that part. I'm the kind of person who trusts topo maps more than turn-by-turn directions, and for 6 straight autumn seasons I was the one they sent out to catalog deer migration patterns in a few remote zones nobody else wanted to mess with. Budget cuts had stripped field partners out of that year, so it was just me, my truck, an ATV, a stack of trail cameras, and a contract I couldn't afford to lose. This was somewhere in the northern Georgia Appalachians. That's as specific as I want to get. People always assume being alone out there is the hard part. It wasn't. The hard part, at least for me, was pretending I wasn't noticing my hearing slipping a little more every season. I was already scared my body was becoming unreliable before any of this started. Not in some dramatic way. Just little things. Missing the first half-second of a sentence if somebody spoke from the wrong side. Having to tilt my head during meetings so it looked like I was listening carefully instead of compensating. Nodding a beat too late. You can hide a lot if you're good at acting like you're busy. I didn't tell coworkers how much I'd started relying on visual patterns over sound. I definitely didn't tell them I was checking the hearing test booths at pharmacies the way some people check blood pressure machines. Out in the field, though, I could still tell myself I was better than most of them because I knew what animal movement looked like on a ridgeline before I ever downloaded a camera card. I knew where deer crossed, where they avoided, where they'd pause, where coyotes would cut behind them. I trusted that more than I trusted a spreadsheet in somebody else's office. The job that week was to revisit a ridge section where several cameras had been failing in a cluster. Fresh batteries, sealed housings, no obvious water damage, and still they'd either stop recording or spit back corrupted files. The office wanted a clean data run before end of month. I wanted the invoice paid on time. Necessity is usually less noble than people make it sound. The access route was a locked forestry gate, then a slow 3-mile ATV trail over narrow ridges and through dead chestnut groves that always looked, to me, like they'd been cooked from the inside out. The smell out there was wet leaf rot mixed with mineral-heavy creek water. It got into your clothes and your truck seats. By the time I'd unloaded the hard cases, mounted the ATV rack, and checked my battery packs, I already had fine grit rubbing between my teeth from the dry ridge dust. It was one of those details you notice because you can't stop noticing it. Every time I bit down, it felt like I'd chewed sand. While I was unloading equipment, I saw the tracks for the first time. Dozens of deer prints ran across a muddy slope near the trail cut, fresh enough that the edges were still holding. But instead of crossing a particular section of hillside, every set bent sharply around it. Not fanned out, not random. It looked organized, which is not a word I like using for deer. They approached the same patch, turned at almost the same angle, then rejoined farther down. I stood there with one case in my hand for probably a full minute, looking from the tracks to the hillside and back again. Then I told myself there was probably a scent source, old runoff, maybe a predator den under the rocks, something normal. Animals avoid small things for reasons people miss all the time. I got camp set before dark. Nothing fancy, just the truck, a compact heater, a little folding table, and a tarp awning in case the weather turned. I spent the afternoon swapping memory cards, testing camera triggers, recording sign in my field book, and walking transects between marked trees. The first day felt routine enough that I caught myself easing back into my usual rhythm. I cooked canned stew beside the portable heater after sunset, ate it too hot, burned the top of my mouth, and listened to wind moving through those dead chestnuts while coyotes barked somewhere across the valley. Their calls bounced around the folds of the mountain and flattened out in strange ways, but that wasn't unusual. A lot of those drainage basins threw sound sideways. I remember the burnt peanut butter smell from the stale protein bars I'd left on the dash too long. I had one anyway because field hunger makes you accept things that should probably be thrown out. The stitching inside my insulated gloves had started fraying, and every time I flexed my hand, the rough seams scraped across my knuckles. My thermos lid had a tiny leak in the seal, so every few minutes it made this little hiss against the cooling metal like it was whispering to itself. That's the kind of thing I remember. Not because it matters, just because that's how memory works when you're alone long enough. By the second afternoon, I was already thinking the office had overreacted about the camera failures. A couple housings had been knocked crooked, likely by bear or curious raccoons, and one was packed with spider web across the sensor window. I logged it, cleaned it, moved on. The ridge section itself was odd in a way I couldn't really defend with data yet. Animal movement looked guided. Trails converged, then peeled away from the same strips of ground. Prints overlapped in ways that looked less like natural wandering and more like hesitation. Still, if somebody had asked me then, I would have shrugged and said terrain pressure, rock shelves, scent drift. There is almost always a practical answer if you wait long enough to find it. The first wrong note came near dusk. I was standing above a drainage basin checking a camera strap when I heard a deer snort from downhill, sharp and wet, the kind of warning blast that carries even when the air is heavy. 3 seconds later, I heard the same snort again, at the exact same pitch and rhythm. Not similar. The same. It was like somebody had pressed replay. I stopped with the strap half tightened and listened. Nothing else came after it. Just the wind, a couple dry leaves skipping over stone, then the regular hush of the creek below. I remember actually nodding to myself like I'd solved it. The basin had rock walls on 2 sides and a narrow throat opening toward the lower hollow. I figured the first call had bounced strangely and come back delayed. I've heard weird echoes in mountain cuts before, especially at dusk when the air starts layering. I finished tightening the strap, made a note about acoustics in the margin, mostly as a joke, and walked back to camp genuinely satisfied with that explanation. The thing about a slow build is it gives you time to practice being wrong. Over the next few days, the abnormalities got more specific, but none of them felt big enough on their own to justify packing up. The first camera set from the far ridge captured partial animal bodies passing too close to the lens. Except it wasn't just blur. One sequence showed a deer torso and forelegs moving through frame with no head visible anywhere. Another caught the rear half of what looked like a coyote, but the angle made no sense, like the rest of the body should have been there and simply wasn't. I checked the housings for tilt, checked the mounting angle, checked for file corruption. I even recreated the path by walking in front of the lens myself. All I got from that was a batch of pictures where I looked like a tired park ranger impersonator. Then there were the tracks. More than once I found fresh sign in open mud that stopped clean. Not faded out over rock, not interrupted by roots, just there and then not there. Deer prints, 2 clean impressions, maybe 4, then nothing on a patch of ground that should have held at least another dozen. I crouched over one set long enough for my knees to ache and finally decided the surface composition must have changed. Thin crust, hidden rock shelf, something like that. Plausible enough to log and ignore. At night, something started circling camp. That sounds bigger than it felt at first. It was mostly noise. A low shape moving beyond the firelight and heater glow, staying outside the ring where details become details. I'd hear an owl note that was almost right, then a fox scream cut short in a way that made it sound like a cough. Then another deer snort. Once I heard what I thought was a coyote bark. Then the exact same bark again after the same tiny pause. Not close together by chance. Spaced, repeated. Mechanical precision inside an animal sound. I honestly wondered if my hearing problems were distorting normal animal sounds into patterns. I need to be honest about that because it mattered. I had enough pride wrapped up in being competent out there that my first instinct was to suspect myself before I suspected the woods. I'd sit still in the truck, engine off, and wait for the next sound, almost hoping it'd come back wrong in a way I could blame on wind direction or my own ears. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. The nights got worse because my sleep got worse. If you only sleep in little torn-up pieces, everything starts to feel staged. I was making bad coffee before dawn, chewing half-stale bars that smelled like burnt peanut butter and dust, rubbing my gloves together to warm my fingers, telling myself I just needed one more clean run of data, and then I'd be out. During daylight, I could still function. I replaced camera cards, checked straps, downloaded files to the laptop, and maintained enough routine that I felt like the work itself was proof nothing was actually wrong. Then I found the notebook. I kept my main field notebook in the truck most of the time because if it got soaked, the survey was useless. That day I'd made entries near noon, closed it, locked the cab, and gone another half-mile downridge to reset 2 cameras above a creek crossing. When I came back at dusk, the notebook was open on the passenger seat. Not just moved. Open. Folded to the page where I'd marked the cluster of malfunctioning cameras. I know how that sounds. And yes, the first thing I did was check myself. Maybe I hadn't locked it. Maybe I'd left it open and forgotten. Maybe I'd set it there before walking away. But I remember the click of the lock because I always locked the truck, even when there was nobody for miles. I remember sliding the notebook under the seat because I didn't want drizzle blowing in through the cracked window. It was open anyway, the elastic strap hanging loose like a tongue. I stood there with one hand on the door frame and felt my stomach go hollow in a way I don't really have a prettier phrase for. I should have left after the notebook showed up inside the truck. That's the clean version of the story, and it's also the true one. But replacing that survey contract would have financially ruined me for the season. I'd already counted the money against bills. I'd already spent part of it in my head. Once you do that, good judgment gets negotiated down. So I did what people do when they want to remain the kind of person they believed they were that morning. I searched for signs of entry. Found none, rechecked the locks, moved the truck closer to camp, and kept going. I told myself if someone was messing with me, I'd find evidence. If it was my own fatigue, I'd catch that too. Either way, one more night, then one more. By then, even the normal parts of the place had started arranging themselves in ways I couldn't name. The dead chestnuts clicked together overhead in the wind, and every now and then the whole ridge would go quiet in a way that felt edited, like sound had been cut instead of fading. Cameras failed in a neat radius around that bent track hillside. Animal paths kept curving around it. I caught myself watching the tree line not because I'd seen anything there, but because too much around it seemed to be pointing. I don't remember whether it was the 5th or 6th night because the sleep deprivation blurred together after a point. I was outside camp with the binoculars around my neck, maybe 40 yards from the truck, checking the dark edge of a stand of thin trees beyond the heater light. I hadn't heard anything for a while, which felt wrong by then. No repeating calls, no circling steps, not even coyotes in the distance. Just the creak and the soft metal tick from the heater cooling down. Then I saw what I took for one easy second to be a deer standing behind the trees. Only it was too vertical. Not fully, not like a person standing in the open where your brain would accept it immediately. More like a deer shape arranged upward. The front end lifted, neck too still, body half hidden by trunks no wider than my wrist. It stood there and then it jerked, a short snapped movement to one side followed by complete stillness. Then another jerking shift. No fluid weight transfer, no head bob. Just movement and stop, like frames missing between positions. I remember the inside of my mouth going dry all at once. I could feel that ridge dust against my teeth again. My fingers had gone numb enough that I fumbled the binoculars and hit them against my chest before I got them up. Before that, it made noise. Not one animal noise. Several. A clipped deer snort, then what sounded like the start of a turkey yelp, then a coyote bark, fragmented, out of order, each one cut short like samples. There wasn't any rhythm to it except that none of it belonged together. I raised the binoculars and froze. The reflective eye shine was at shoulder height. I don't mean high because of a slope. I checked that later until I was sick of checking it. I mean the reflected points were level with where a tall person's shoulders would be if they were standing just behind the tree trunks. Too far apart for anything I could explain away in that second. Too high for a deer head. And there was no visible head movement around them. No antlers, no profile, nothing I could settle into a known shape. My legs stopped working the way legs are supposed to work. That's the part people leave out because it sounds stupid, but it's true. I didn't run because my body had gone into that deadlocked mode where all the signals hit at once and cancel each other. I just stood there with the binoculars to my face and watched it. The figure shifted again, one broken little angle at a time, and then it started backing into the darkness, not turning around, backing up, round. Backing. I know the exact phrase because I've gone over it too many times. It retreated while facing me, if facing is even the right word, when I couldn't fully make out the front. Tree trunks kept swallowing pieces of it until there was only the eye shine, then only black, then nothing. No crash through brush, no hoofbeats, nothing leaving except absence. That snapped me loose. I stumbled backward hard enough to catch a boot heel on the edge of the fire ring and almost went down into the heater and cookpot. I got the truck door open on the second try because my hands were shaking too badly on the handle. Once I was inside, I locked everything, started the engine, and left half my camp standing. I drove the ATV out at first light because I wasn't thinking clearly enough to break camp in the dark without making noise I'd regret. The ride back to the locked gate felt longer than the whole week had. Every chestnut trunk looked like it might have something behind it. Every turn in the trail made my pulse jump up into my face. The weirdest detail I remember is the thermos rolling in the passenger footwell and hissing every time I hit a rut because the lid still hadn't sealed right. I filed the report early and added a separate note about suspicious nighttime activity. I did not write upright deer thing because I wanted to be taken seriously at least once in my life. I wrote about repeated synthetic sounding calls, equipment interference, altered access to a locked vehicle, and abnormal movement patterns. Forestry officials attribute events to organized poachers using electronic sound lures and hidden blinds. A week later, they told me crews had found evidence of illegal hunters operating through that region, including partially concealed blinds, scent control stations, and call devices rigged near known game paths. On paper, that explained almost everything that mattered. Even the camera files fit better once they said that. Bad angles because someone had shifted the housings. Animal bodies cut out of frame because poachers were manipulating approach routes. Repeating calls because electronic lures were placed around the drainage. My notebook inside the truck could have meant I'd failed to lock it, or someone had gotten close enough while I was farther down ridge and taken a risk. None of that is impossible. In fact, most of it is more likely than anything else. What didn't fit was the movement pattern across multiple cameras, and one frame in particular they couldn't explain any better than I could. It showed a deer herd, 7 animals, maybe 8 if one body at the edge counted. All of them were facing the same direction. All of them were completely motionless, not grazing, not stepping, not turning an ear. Just fixed. The timestamp showed them standing that way for over 14 minutes. Same frame sequence, same posture, same direction, as if something off camera had shut them down in place. Hunters can lure, they can hide, they can push animals. I get that, but not like that. The rational explanation is still coordinated poachers using electronic wildlife calls to manipulate movement. And if you want the version of this story that makes sense, that's the one I'd tell you to keep. It almost accounts for everything. Almost. The part it can't account for is why a herd animal built to bolt would stand frozen in a line and stare into the trees for 14 minutes. Or why, when I think about that upright shape now, what gets to me isn't what I saw. It's how much of the ridge seemed to already understand it. I don't do overnight surveys alone anymore. I don't care what the contract pays. If the job sheet says solo after dark, I slide it back across the desk and keep my mouth shut until they hand it to somebody else. Some things don't rush you. They let you settle in first. They let you tell yourself the odd details have practical explanations right up until you realize those explanations were part of what kept you there. Story 2. Something under the bridge. The bathroom door in that cabin didn't lock right, so I had a towel jammed under the bottom and my suitcase shoved against it and both hands braced on the edge of the sink like that was going to matter if something really wanted in. Outside, something dragged slowly across the porch boards. Not footsteps, not scratching. A long pull, then a pause, then another pull, wood groaning under weight. Rainwater ticked off the gutter outside the little frosted window, and under all of that I could hear a low clicking beneath the floorboards, like fingernails or maybe little stones tapped together in a patient rhythm. I was barefoot because I'd kicked my socks off when I heard the first cabinet open downstairs, and the tile was so cold it made my toes ache. My damp denim cuffs kept brushing against the floor every time I shifted, and I remember being irrationally angry about that. Like if I could have fixed my jeans, I could have fixed the rest of the night. My phone was in my hand and my thumb wouldn't stop slipping because my palm was wet. I had the emergency screen open. I was trying not to breathe loud enough to hear myself breathe. That's where this starts. Even though the actual story begins 3 days earlier, when I still thought I'd rented myself a quiet place to fall apart in private. I rented that place because I couldn't stand hearing people tell me everything would eventually feel normal again. My divorce had dragged on for months and not in a dignified, grown-up way either. It was messy and public and humiliating in the exact modern way that means everybody knows half the truth and fills in the rest with whatever version makes them feel useful. Friends reached out, family reached out, people I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had soft voices and advice. I deleted my social media accounts one by one in the same afternoon, which felt dramatic when I was doing it, and then oddly small right after, like I'd swept crumbs off a table and called it a life change. I didn't want support, I didn't want perspective, I didn't want to be observed while I got through it. So I found an isolated rental cabin somewhere in the western North Carolina mountains. Booked 10 days. Packed clothes without really looking at what I was throwing in, and drove 2 hours from the nearest major highway in steady early spring rain. The cabin sat past a narrow wooden bridge over a shallow ravine. The water under it wasn't dramatic, just creek runoff and brown stones, but the bridge gave a hollow knocking sound during rainfall that traveled up through the planks into the car tires. The first time I crossed, I slowed down because it felt like I was driving over an empty chest. On the other side, there was a crooked gravel pull-in, some rhododendron pressed close to the porch, and a little one-room cabin with a loft tucked under a damp tree line. The owner met me there to hand off the key because, in his words, the lock stuck if you were too polite with it. He was one of those people who tries to seem casual by talking too much. He mentioned the heater, the weird hot water delay, the fact that the box fan in the loft only rotated if you nudged it. Then while I was getting my duffel from the trunk, He said not to leave trash outside because raccoons figure things out fast around here. He laughed when he said it, not as a warning exactly, more like local color. I laughed too. I was trying very hard to seem like a woman renting a cabin for some restful reading, not a woman who had cried in a grocery store parking lot 3 days before because she saw the crackers her ex used to buy. At first, the place felt like exactly what I'd paid for. Quiet in a way that wasn't empty, just tucked away. The floorboards smelled faintly sour from trapped mildew, the kind of damp wooden smell that cheap scented candles can't quite cover. There were 2 of those candles on the windowsill by the sink, both with an artificial cinnamon smell so strong it almost had a plastic note underneath. I unpacked paperbacks, made soup from a carton, put my phone face down on the table and let it stay there. Rain tapped the metal roof. Creek water moved beneath the bridge outside. The box fan in the loft made a click every time it swung sideways, like it was reconsidering the effort. I told myself I could reset there. That sounds corny and I know it does, but if you've had a part of your life fall apart in front of people, privacy starts feeling like medicine. The first evening I sat at the table with a blanket over my knees, reading the same page of a paperback 3 times because my brain wouldn't hold on to it. And I remember thinking maybe this was the first place in months where nobody expected me to answer for anything. The first wrong thing was the toothbrush. I had gone for a short walk down past the bridge, not far, just enough to look at the ravine and feel cold air on my face. When I got back, my toothbrush was on the sink counter backward, with the bristles pointing toward the mirror and the handle toward the wall. I know that sounds like nothing because it is nothing if you're not the one who set it down an hour earlier. I always place toothbrushes the same way, handle out, because I hate reaching around clutter. It was such a tiny thing I actually stared at it and laughed once through my nose like, wow, okay, this is where you're at now. I kept thinking divorce stress was turning normal forgetfulness into paranoia. That's what I went with, and honestly, it made sense. New place, bad sleep, my routine knocked sideways. I could have set it down without noticing. I could have bumped the cup. I could have been turning ordinary absent-mindedness into some big symbolic violation because I was already raw. So I turned it back around, washed my face, and made a point of not letting myself spiral over a toothbrush. I was trying so hard to be reasonable then. Harder than I should have had to. The kitchen incidents built that way, one small enough to dismiss, then another, then another. I can't remember the exact order the kitchen incidents happened because every morning started feeling identical. That's part of why it got under my skin. Each day I woke up in the loft to pale gray rain light and the ticking box fan, and for a second I had to remind myself where I was, then what had changed, then whether I'd imagined any of the things from the day before. One morning the pantry door was open. I closed it and told myself the latch hadn't caught. The next morning both pantry doors were standing wide open and a package of crackers was on the counter. I stood there in my socks with the kettle in my hand and just looked at it, trying to think through whether I could have left them out the night before. I decided yes, probably. Then no, probably not. Then yes again because the alternative was ridiculous. That same day I noticed one of my mugs, the blue one with a chipped rim, sitting on the windowsill above the sink. I hadn't put anything on that sill because it was warped and sloped inward. I picked the mug up and found a damp ring of dirt under it, just a little crescent smear. I washed the mug twice, even though it wasn't dirty. After dark, I started hearing movement beneath the cabin. Slow movement, not the quick scatter of something small. More like weight shifting and dragging under the floor, followed by those soft clicking noises. Every time I switched on more lights, it stopped. Not faded, stopped. Which sounds worse now than it did then because at the time I kept translating everything into possible animal behavior. Maybe raccoons, maybe a possum under the foundation, maybe tree branches tapping in ways that echoed through the crawl space. Anxiety makes you work overtime to build a normal explanation. It doesn't just make you afraid, it makes you exhausted. One morning I found wet footprints beneath the kitchen table. Not a full trail. Just enough to register as footprints before the details got slippery. The floor there was old varnished wood and the prints were more like darker patches in the damp. Long enough for me to see the shape and not long enough for me to photograph clearly before they faded. I crouched to look at them, and the smell coming up from the floorboards was that sour mildew mixed with cold, wet earth. By the time I came back with my phone, they were almost gone. I ended up with 3 useless, blurry pictures of my own knees and the leg of a chair. I started checking objects before I went upstairs. Spoon by the sink, book on the couch arm, candle by the bed. It makes me sound unwell, and maybe I was. But there is a specific kind of panic that comes from feeling your private space get used by something else. Not broken into, not ransacked, just touched. Slightly, intimately, like your routine is being learned. I nearly left after I saw the handprints under the bridge railing. It had rained all morning and then let up around noon. I walked out to the bridge with coffee because I needed air that didn't smell like cinnamon and mildew. On the inside of the railing, where you wouldn't see them from the road, there were 2 muddy handprints low on the wood, fingers curled upward from underneath like somebody had climbed up just enough to look over. The mud was dark and fresh, with little grains of grit embedded in the palm marks. I stood there with the mug in my hand until the coffee went cold. My first thought was that somebody from maintenance had checked the supports. My second thought was that there was no maintenance. My third thought was that if I packed the car right then and drove home, I'd have to explain to people why a rental cabin beat me. That was the embarrassing truth. Admitting fear felt emotionally unbearable after the divorce because I'd already spent months being looked at as the person who couldn't hold it together. I should have driven away the first time something moved inside that cabin. But I stayed because leaving would have felt like one more public failure, even if nobody ever knew about it. That night I took my phone to bed with me fully charged and a kitchen knife I told myself was just for peace of mind. I remember how stupid that knife looked against the floral quilt. I remember laughing at myself once quietly, because if anyone had seen me from outside, I would have looked like the final form of post-divorce instability, hiding in a loft with a paperback and a steak knife. The noises started after midnight. First, a cabinet door downstairs, slow enough that I heard the little change in air pressure before the hinge creak. Then another. Then the clicking from under the floor, closer than it had ever been. Not random, patient. I rolled out of bed and went to the loft railing in my socks, crouching so low my knees popped. The downstairs lamp was off, but the refrigerator light had spilled a weak square across the kitchen because somebody had opened it. Somebody was in there. At first, all I could make out was a pale, crouched shape moving on all fours between the table and the counter. Human pale, not animal pale. Bare forearms, maybe, or a face catching the refrigerator light for half a second. It moved with a deliberate care that hit me harder than if it had rushed. It wasn't searching wildly, it was navigating. It knew where the chairs were. It knew which drawer handles stuck. I watched it pull one drawer out, then another, then close them most of the way, but not fully. Like it had done that before and knew how much sound each one made. Then it stood up near the refrigerator. Not all the way straight at first. More like unfolding. Thin, damp-looking clothes hanging wrong, head tilted toward the loft like it was listening. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I could feel my pulse in my teeth. I wanted to back away from the railing, but I couldn't do it because moving felt louder than staying still. It opened the silverware drawer, then the cabinet where I'd put the soup, then the lower pantry. It was using the kitchen with this awful familiarity, like I was the guest and it was checking what I'd disturbed. After a minute, it stopped directly beneath the loft opening. I didn't hear it breathe. I heard the rain start again on the roof. I heard the old box fan click once as it rotated and stopped halfway, and I heard one floorboard at the base of the stairs take weight. That was when my body finally started moving. I backed into the bathroom attached to the loft, pulled the door shut, shoved my suitcase against it, and turned the lock even though I already knew it barely caught. The clicking started under the floorboards again, directly below me this time. Then the first slow step on the stairs, then another, almost no sound at all, just the light complaint of old wood. I called emergency services, whispering at first, then louder when the operator couldn't hear me. I remember saying, "There's someone in the cabin," and feeling insane the second the words left my mouth because I still had some part of my brain trying to turn it into a misunderstanding. The dragging sound across the porch started while I was on the phone, or maybe right after. My timeline there is ugly. What I know is that I heard movement outside the bathroom wall where there shouldn't have been any outside space, then the long pull across the porch boards, then silence so complete I could hear rainwater dripping off the faucet in the sink. Deputies got there faster than I expected and slower than my body could tolerate. By the time headlights hit the cabin windows, I was shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone trying to wave at them through the bathroom glass. They cleared the cabin, then the loft, then the bridge and the ravine below. I didn't come out until one of them said my name twice and asked if I could unlock the bathroom without opening it all the way. Deputies conclude an unidentified squatter accessed the cabin through foundation gaps beneath the bridge. They found a concealed crawlspace entrance tucked under the far side of the bridge where brush had grown over a narrow drop into the ravine. From there, according to them, somebody could move under the bridge supports and into spaces beneath the cabin foundation, where warped floor panels had opened enough to allow entry. They found signs of occupation under there too. Old food wrappers, blankets, plastic bottles. Things tucked into the dirt like somebody had been staying a while. No suspect was located. The owner got quiet in a hurry after that. A couple weeks later, the listing was gone. That explanation is the one I tell myself when I want to sleep. A hidden squatter beneath the cabin, learning my schedule, waiting until lights were off. Moving through the place when I was upstairs. It accounts for the pantry, the footprints, the handprints, the noises, even the way that figure opened drawers like it already knew where things were. It also explains why the whole experience felt so violating, because it meant my privacy wasn't broken once. It was studied. The detail that won't sit right is that several objects moved before I'd ever unpacked them publicly inside the cabin. The toothbrush, yes. But also a paperback I found on the couch arm the first night after I'd left it inside my zipped duffel. And my blue chipped mug on the sill before I'd used it there even once. You can say I forgot. Maybe I did. I said that to myself over and over, but that explanation requires me to have been carelessly visible in ways I still can't reconstruct. I sleep with lights on now, everywhere. Doesn't matter if it's my apartment, a hotel, or my sister's guest room for one night. Every lamp stays on, and I leave the bathroom light burning too because I learned what it feels like when a place stops being yours before you've even finished unpacking. The worst stories aren't always about what you saw. Sometimes they're about what was already set up and waiting, just outside the part of your life you thought nobody else could reach. Story 3. The Thing in Ravine 9. My younger brother disappeared on a solo hunting trip years ago, and there are only so many ways to say that before people start expecting the sentence after it to be acceptance. There isn't one. Not a real one. He went into Appalachian backcountry and didn't come back out, and the search that followed turned into the kind of operation where people get clipboards and zones and volunteers and theories, and then eventually, after enough weather and enough budget meetings, it turns into paperwork. I joined the volunteer teams during the original search and never really stopped after the formal effort thinned out. What began as helping became habit, then structure, then something uglier than structure. I spent years learning route marking, search patterns, incident documentation, missing person protocols, all of it. If there was a grid to walk or a remote drainage to check, I signed up, partly because I wanted to be useful, and partly because usefulness is easier to live with than guilt. I've spent years trying to convince myself my brother's disappearance wasn't partly my fault. The reason that line belongs in this story is simple. He had mentioned earlier that season that something felt wrong in one of the areas he liked to hunt. Not wrong in a supernatural way, just wrong as in signs of someone else being out there. Moved gear, odd noises, trails marked and then not marked. I laughed it off at the time because he'd always had a talent for making ordinary mountain weirdness sound personal. When he vanished, that conversation calcified in my head. If I'd taken him seriously, maybe I would have gone with him. Maybe I'd have pushed harder for a different area. Maybe I would have noticed the pattern before he walked into it alone. Those are useless thoughts, but useless thoughts are what grief feeds on. After enough years on search teams, you get comfortable with isolation in a practical sense. You're alone, but you're working. Your hands are busy. Your eyes keep inventory. The mountains stop feeling vast and start feeling segmented. All these folds and ravines and drainages that can be read if you give them enough attention. I trusted procedure. I trusted trail marking. I trusted the fact that most mysteries in rough terrain are made of timing, weather, and bad luck. The area that pulled me back that winter was an old ravine system locals unofficially called Ravine 9, somewhere in the southwestern Virginia Appalachians. The name came from old mining maps and stuck around after the roads stopped mattering. It was reachable only through restricted Forestry Service paths and then a rough approach on foot past abandoned access roads, collapsed cable equipment, and long rock trenches where runoff pooled bright with old chemicals. There had been witness statements connected to my brother's disappearance that never lined up right around that section. Different dates, different directions. One person hearing a call from below when everyone else was uphill. Another reporting trail ribbon that had vanished and then shown up farther down a spur. I dug through old notes for weeks before going back. Volunteer logs, search maps, a photocopied page with weather notes, my own scribbles from back then. The inconsistencies didn't prove anything, but they gathered. That's what sent me in alone late that winter. Not bravery, not closure. Stubbornness mixed with the kind of anger that wears a responsible face. A retired volunteer I called before the trip listened to me explain my route. Sighed for a long time, then said people occasionally hear injured animals crying from impossible directions inside those trench systems. He didn't frame it as a warning exactly, more like a local fact. Sound carries strange in there, he said. It comes back from places it shouldn't. I wrote it down and kept planning because by then every caution just sounded like another piece to check. The first several hours in the ravine were ordinary in the most dangerous way. I parked at the end of an overgrown service track, hiked in with a body camera clipped to my chest, and started marking my route with reflective tape. The air down there held a sharp chemical smell from rusted mining runoff pools, and in the narrow rock trenches there was a constant dripping echo that made it hard to judge distance. Wind barely reached the floor of the ravine, so the cold sat still. Every step through orange mud left my bootlaces dusted and stained. I had cheap pain relief cream on both wrists because cold weather always lit up an old tendon problem, and every time I flexed my hands, I caught that minty smell rising off my gloves. My laminated search maps kept crinkling in my jacket pocket whenever I bent or turned, which got annoying enough that I almost took them out. I documented abandoned equipment as I went, half-buried cable spools, bent fence posts. The remains of a pulley rig hanging from a tree that had grown around part of it. None of it meant anything on its own. That's important. At the time, it all just felt like an old work site being slowly eaten by weather. If I sound precise now, it's because I watched the body cam footage later and compared it to my field notes in the recovery inventory. The horror of that place didn't arrive in one clean moment. It assembled. The first thing I noticed was one of my own reflective markers tied farther ahead along the ravine wall. I had just placed it maybe 5 minutes earlier on a low branch at a fork, bright silver strip with orange backing. Then, after following the left cut toward a collapsed trench, I looked up and there it was again, knotted around a sapling ahead of me at shoulder height. Same tear on the end. Same little dirt thumbprint on the tape where I'd pressed it with my glove. My immediate thought was another volunteer must have been in there recently and used the same markers, maybe even one from an old roll that had gotten mixed with mine. That was a reach, but not a ridiculous one. People reuse supplies all the time. I untied it, checked the original spot on the way back, and found nothing there, which only pushed me harder toward explanation. Somebody else had worked the area, somebody careless, somebody unofficial. I should have reported the moved trail markers immediately instead of treating them like a puzzle. Instead, I did what I always do when something doesn't fit. I investigated. I doubled back, checked for other sign, started looking for boot prints that didn't match mine, and marked the time in my notes. The moved marker turned into a question I could solve, and solving questions has been my excuse for staying in bad places longer than I should. I kept going deeper because I believed the evidence was accumulating toward a human answer. And I wanted that answer badly enough to ignore the part of myself that had begun tightening up. At first, the escalations were almost neat. A flashlight I'd set on a flat rock while adjusting my pack turned up 10 minutes later on a different rock 3 yards away, wiped surprisingly clean of mud. A length of cord I had absolutely stepped over on the trail appeared coiled beside a runoff channel in a tidy loop, as if someone had arranged it for me to notice. An old canteen half buried in silt 1 hour showed up resting upright on a ledge the next. Each thing could have been explained by memory or distraction if you'd isolated it. Together they suggested attention, not attack. Attention. Then came the cries. They sounded like injured wildlife from just beyond sight lines, the sort of desperate, sharp calls that make trained volunteers change pace without realizing it. A rabbit scream once. Another time, something that might have been a fox. Once I heard what I thought was a deer bawl from the opposite side of a trench where there wasn't a safe approach. Each time I moved toward the sound, it stopped abruptly. Not faded into distance. Stopped. Then after a while, I'd hear a different cry from somewhere else. I kept wondering if grief was making me force connections between unrelated evidence. That line matters because it was the last rational defense I had against my own obsession. I had spent years carrying my brother into places where he wasn't. I knew that. I knew grief is capable of turning coincidence into structure. But the reason I stayed wasn't denial. It was the opposite. I became convinced somebody had secretly occupied that ravine system for years, and might be connected, if not to my brother directly, then to other disappearances and false leads that had sent search crews the wrong way. Once that idea took hold, leaving felt impossible. If a person had been using those ravines as cover, then every moved marker was not just weird. It was a method. Looking back, the escalations seem obvious in a way they did not at the time. The first moved marker tested whether I'd notice. I noticed, but I didn't leave. The cleaned equipment tested whether I understood I was being watched. I understood it enough to get more focused, not enough to retreat. The sound lures tested whether I would follow. I followed repeatedly. Every step I took told whoever was in there exactly how far I could be led. By the time I reached the collapsed mining structure, daylight had flattened into that late afternoon gray where everything underground looks closer than it is. The entrance wasn't a proper tunnel mouth so much as a broken cut in the rock wall, where rotten timbers and fallen stone had created a half-enclosed chamber. Water ran through it in a shallow sheet. There were rust stains down the stone and old cable hooks overhead. I paused there to check the body cam battery and remember thinking the place smelled less like the chemical pools outside and more like wet cloth and old metal. Then I saw the first bedding area. It was tucked behind a fallen timber in a recess I would have missed if the flashlight hadn't caught the edge of plastic. Blankets filthy but layered. A milk crate with food tins and bottles. A stack of canned goods with labels peeled off. More storage farther in, hidden under tarps. Somebody had been living there a long time, not just passing through. My pulse kicked hard enough that I felt it in my jaw. This was what I'd been looking for, and it should have made me feel vindicated first. Instead, I felt my stomach drop, because evidence that confirmed my theory also meant the person attached to it could be close. Could be listening already. I moved deeper. I know people will ask why, and the answer is because investigation had become momentum. I started recording everything out loud for the camera, noting the bedding, the food, the improvised shelving. Then I looked up and saw dozens of stolen search markers hanging from wires overhead, not just mine, old ones too. Reflective tape, survey ribbon, numbered tags, all suspended in lines above the tunnel cut so they'd stir in the slightest air movement. Some were from organized searches I remembered personally. Some had handwriting on them from volunteers who were dead now or too old to climb that terrain anymore. They made a faint dry sound against each other, almost delicate. If you've never seen evidence of your own efforts turned into somebody else's decoration, it's hard to describe how violating that felt. Years of people searching for the missing, gathered and hung like trophies in a place designed to mislead them. That's when I heard my brother's voice. Not literally his whole voice, not a conversation. Just my childhood nickname, clear from deeper in the tunnel network. The name only family used, 2 syllables spoken in his cadence. My head snapped so fast I pulled something in my neck. For one impossible second, I was a kid again hearing him call from the backyard. Then every part of me flooded hot and cold at the same time because he couldn't have been there. Some sections of those tunnels connected strangely, so my timeline inside the ravine may not be perfectly accurate. What I know is I went toward the voice. I rounded a corner past a timber brace and collided with a human figure coming the other way so suddenly our shoulders and chests hit before either of us could react. The impact knocked the flashlight beam wild across wet stone. He was filthy, that registered first. Not muddy from one day outside, filthy in layers like the ravine had gotten into the fabric. Mismatched hunting gear hung off him in pieces, one camouflage sleeve, another plain work jacket, straps crossing his chest with little homemade devices hanging from them. Tubes, reeds, plastic housings, speaker bits. I smelled damp wool, body odor, and something sweet and rotten under it. He made a sound right in my face that was half grunt, half animal cry. We went down into the runoff water together. It was shallow but enough to throw my footing. My knee hit rock. My elbow hit something harder. He was wiry and stronger than he looked because he moved like somebody who'd spent years crawling through bad spaces. He grabbed at my chest rig and I felt the body camera strap yank against my neck. I hit him with the flashlight, not cleanly, more in panic than aim. He answered by making another series of noises, clipped and mechanical and wrong, one after another, like he was choosing from a set of sounds he knew would scramble a person's thinking. There was a flare gun in the side pouch of my pack, standard emergency gear, not a weapon in my mind until that second. I remember the red handle slick in my hand. I remember him lunging low. I remember the water splashing up cold into my mouth. When I fired, the tunnel flashed white-red for an instant, bright enough to erase depth. I didn't stand there to see where it hit exactly. I saw him recoil and heard a scream that broke apart into animal noises almost immediately, and I ran. Not well, not bravely. I scrambled uphill through rock cuts and brush with one boot half unlaced and my maps crinkling in my pocket every time I slipped. Behind me, he kept yelling, but the yells kept turning into calls. Coyote, fox, something bird-like, then human again. That was almost worse than being chased cleanly because I couldn't tell if he was following or just filling the ravine with noise to break my sense of direction. I fell once on the slope and tore both palms on gravel. I left a marker roll behind. I left at least one battery pack. I didn't stop until I reached the service road, and even then I was still listening for my brother's nickname under the sound of my own breathing. Authorities later raided the ravine system after I turned over the body cam footage, my notes, and the location data I had. Authorities identify evidence of long-term hidden habitation and theft within abandoned mining infrastructure. They found bedding, food caches, stolen supplies from hikers and search crews, improvised sound devices, access paths cut between collapsed sections, and enough evidence to show that somebody had been living and moving through that network for a very long time. They also recovered search materials from multiple older operations, including markers that should never have been there unless someone had been collecting them deliberately. The primary suspect died before providing coherent statements. Depending on who you ask, that either closes the story or makes it worse. He never gave a clear account of how long he'd been down there, where he got some of the equipment, or how many times he'd interacted with searchers without being seen. He never answered the questions that mattered most to the families tied to those older disappearances. So yes, in a practical sense, I won. I went back, found evidence, survived the encounter, and forced a response authorities couldn't ignore. But winning in that kind of place doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like having your suspicions honored by reality in the least useful way possible. For a while after, people treated me like I'd solved something. And I had, sort of. A hidden man in abandoned mining tunnels using recordings, lures, and stolen equipment to manipulate search efforts and possibly prey on people moving through isolated terrain. That explanation almost perfectly fits the moved markers, the redirected cries, the carefully cleaned and repositioned objects, the accumulated trophies overhead. It even fits the voice in the tunnel if you assume he'd gathered enough from overheard conversations, old tapes, or effects from prior encounters to mimic personal details. The part that refuses to fit is the recording they recovered from one of his devices. On it, mixed in with animal distress calls and bits of human speech, is my brother's private nickname for me. Not my legal name, not a shortened version friends used. The actual family nickname nobody outside the house heard more than once or twice, and certainly not in the woods, at least not that anyone can prove. There is no known public source for it, no old search interview where it appears. No social media post to scrape, no volunteer log, nothing. You can tell me my brother must have said it aloud sometime years earlier, maybe during a hunt, maybe within earshot of somebody he didn't know was listening. That's the best rational explanation available, and I do try to live inside it, but retroactive fear does something ugly to your memory. It takes all the moments that seemed merely odd and relabels them. The moved markers were not a prank. They were a test. The cleaned flashlight, the neatly positioned canteen, the cries from impossible directions, none of that was random mountain weirdness. It was a person teaching himself how far he could steer other people without showing his face. And once you understand that, every old search story you use to dismiss as confusion starts reshaping itself in your head. I keep one recovered search marker hanging beside my garage door now. Not for closure, not as a memorial exactly, more like a reminder of what attention looks like when it's used the wrong way. Every morning when I leave the house, I check that marker to make sure it's hanging exactly where I left it, and if it's twisted even a little, I stop and look around the yard before I get in the truck.